Oh, actually, we have to. But the. Oh, this is the High Commissioner doing the.
Voilà, bonjour à toutes et à
Good morning to everyone. The 8,723rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is peacebuilding and sustaining peace, transitional justice in conflict and post-conflict situations. The agenda is adopted. I wish to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of the following countries to participate in this meeting: Angola, Argentina, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Croatia, Egypt, El Salvador, Fiji, the Gambia, Georgia, Guatemala, India, Iraq, Italy, Japan, Kenya, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Malta, Morocco, Nepal, the Netherlands, Norway, Pakistan, Peru, Portugal, Qatar, Romania, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sri Lanka, Switzerland, the Syrian Arab Republic, Turkey, and Ukraine. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Mrs. Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights; Father Francisco de Roo, President of the Commission for the Clarification of Truth, Coexistence, and Non-Repetition; and Mrs. Yasmin Suka, Executive Director of the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa, Trustee of the Desmond Tutu Peace Center, and Chair of the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. It is so decided. Mrs. Bachelet is joining via video teleconference from Geneva. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in the meeting: Mr. Robert Mardini, Permanent Observer of the International Committee of the Red Cross to the United Nations, and His Excellency Mr. Olaf Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to Document S 2020-98, a letter dated 4th of February 2020 from the Permanent Representative of Belgium to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I now give the floor to Mrs. Bachelet.
Vous avez la parole.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I am grateful to Belgium for organizing this vital discussion of such relevance to international peace and security. I am sure it will contribute to the increasing consideration of transitional justice as a useful peace-building tool by this Council and other bodies. We know that lasting peace is interlinked with justice, development, and respect for human rights. We know that peace does not automatically break out when weapons fall silent and atrocity crimes cease. To be able to rebuild lives without fear of recurrence and for society to move forward, suffering needs to be acknowledged, confidence in state institutions restored, and justice done. Demands for justice can be denied, but they will not disappear. In Sudan, the recent popular overthrow of the regime was driven in large part by demands for justice across society, built up over decades of impunity for human rights violations. Across the world, mass protests have once again brought home the power of popular demands for equality, social justice, gender justice, climate justice, and fundamental rights. Transitional justice processes have repeatedly shown they can help to address grievances and divisions. I have seen this firsthand. My own experience in Chile convinced me that transitional justice processes that are context-specific, nationally owned, and focus on the need and informed choices of victims can connect, empower, and transform societies, and thereby contribute to lasting and just peace. The multiple post-conflict and post-authoritarian situations I have witnessed have strengthened that conviction.
Truth-seeking initiatives not only enable victims to recount their experiences, they also open new spaces within which victims and perpetrators can establish connection. They facilitate the recognition and accommodation of multiple narratives about what has occurred, and the formulation of more searching recommendations for redress and reform. Over the past 30 years, various truth commissions in the Americas and elsewhere have greatly contributed to transitional justice processes. Guatemala stands out for its landmark final report of the Truth Commission, Memoria del Silencio, in 1999. The report provided an authoritative record of human rights violations during the conflict, giving a voice to the victims and analyzing the dynamic underlying 36 years of conflict. It was instrumental in advancing victims' rights, including in several high-profile judicial cases on conflict-related sexual violence and other crimes, which have resulted in orders for victim-centered and transformative reparations. Such processes are often deeply empowering for victims, in particular women, indigenous communities, and minorities that have been marginalized. This is vital to healing wounds and binding societies together. I have just returned from a mission to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the recent UN-supported consultations in the Kasai region enable many victims to express their views on truth, reconciliation, reparation, and the prevention of future conflict. These consultations laid the groundwork for the establishment of the Provincial Peace, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission. This locally driven project, like others supported by the Peacebuilding Fund, established important links between transitional justice processes, the root causes of conflict, and socio-economic reintegration. While I was in Bunia, in the Ituri province, I was struck by the strong desire expressed by both the Hema and Lendu communities for transitional justice processes and their emphasis on justice as the path to peace and reconciliation. The current conflict between the Lendu and Hema was preceded by a previous cycle of violence in 2003, which did not give rise to a concerted effort to promote accountability. I am convinced this failure to sustain justice processes have been a factor in the revival of violence today. Equally, inability to address the violence of today could place the future at serious risk of renewed violations and abuses. We have learned these lessons and we know how to address them. The real question is whether there is collective will to do so. In many countries, my office has witnessed the transformative power of transitional justice, particularly the role in shaping guarantees on non-repetition. This comprises a package of recommended measures to prevent the recurrence of conflict and human rights abuses. They are grounded in deep analysis of the root causes and escalating manifestation of conflict and atrocity crimes. UN fact-finding missions and commissions of inquiry have repeatedly played a vital role in bringing facts to light, providing national authorities and the international community with an honest mapping of often complex and long-lasting issues. The contribution of such a recent mechanism in relation to Myanmar, to South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, for example, cannot be overstated. Excellencies, for a society to truly succeed in establishing a transition to sustainable peace, issues such as systemic discrimination and exclusion, institutional deficiencies, unfair power structures, inequality and structural impunity must be identified, acknowledged, and addressed. Guarantees of non-recurrence will therefore often relate to institution building. It is also essential to ensure the broadest possible participation of civil society organizations in decision-making. In recognition of this value, many transitional justice recommendations emphasize the empowerment of civil society, history education, trauma counseling, and memorialization initiatives. In virtually every conflict or post-conflict situation, it is particularly crucial for militaries and police forces, and more broadly, all institutions of government, to regain the confidence of traumatized and abused communities. Fair, even-handed, and accountable use of public power is central to rebuilding shattered trust in law enforcement. To this end, the vetting processes and security sector reforms should be given high priority, noting that the disciplined, professional, and principled force is in also the interest of the security forces and government itself. In Colombia, considerable work is currently being undertaken regarding such guarantees of non-recurrence in the context of the comprehensive system for truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, which my office helps to support. The landmark Victims Law of 2011 calls for a wide range of preventive and potentially transformative measures. They include the promotion of mechanisms that prevent and resolve social conflict, legal empowerment of victims, distributive land restitution measures, and measures to dismantle economic and political structures that have benefited from and given support to armed groups. I acknowledge the importance of this Council's support to this key process. To further this work, the Colombian Commission for the Clarification of Truth, Coexistence, and Non-Repetition has established 28 field presences and engaged in non-repetition dialogues at community level. It has also received thousands of testimonies from victims and individuals from state and military institutions. These and other measures which recognize victims' rights, tackle root causes of the conflict and its consequences for the people, and promote positive social, economic, and political transformation, constitute pillars aimed to structure a culture of non-repetition in the country. And I look forward to hearing Father Francisco de Rua addressing you shortly on his experience and insight in this area. Excellencies, in its Sustaining Peace resolution, this Council has rightfully emphasized that a comprehensive approach to transitional justice is a key component of the effort to sustain peace. Creating trust and understanding between former enemies and crafting a path towards sustainable peace and reconciliation will always be a difficult challenge. Transitional justice, we know, cannot be imported or imposed from outside. Locally led and locally appropriate permutation of transitional justice have the best chances of success. Without humility and modesty, the risk of failures are real. However, the international community and this Council in particular have key roles in assisting transitional states in these complex processes by sharing experiences, mandating international support, and encouraging the implementation of genuinely comprehensive approaches. A recent example is the Council's mandating of UN assistance mission to Afghanistan, explicitly to advise on the, and I will quote, establishment and implementation of judicial and non-judicial processes to address the legacy of large-scale human rights violations and abuses, as well as international crimes, and to prevent their recurrence. End of quote. Clear mandates such as this provide a strong and welcome foundation for UN engagement with government and civil society. Transitional justice should not be seen as an alternative to criminal accountability for perpetrators of atrocity crimes, but that criminal accountability, which is vital, should be accompanied by a broad range of complementary measures to support truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence, which help to break cycles of violence. There is clearly no single way to get the mix of these measures precisely right, but there is a way to go to get it wrong, and that is to consider that victims' rightful demands for justice are an inconvenient distraction that can be papered over or indefinitely delayed. Failure to engage in such processes will not resolve conflict. It will fuel recurrence. I encourage the Security Council to acknowledge and make full use of the transformative impact of transitional justice in its consideration of matters of international peace and security. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie Madame Bachelet de son...
I want to thank Mrs. Bachelet, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Francisco de Rua.
I will express my gratitude to the Security Council and also to the Belgian people for inviting me for this debate about transitional justice, which is so important for us. And I will read my presentation in Spanish.
I would like to begin by expressing on behalf of the victims and the Commission of Truth in Colombia, my thoughts. Transitional justice is the most comprehensive, dynamic, and an encouraging instrument of peace building that the victims around the world and the people that have suffered massive violation of their human rights in armed conflicts, domestic armed conflicts have. Today, it's the best international response to the major war-related tragedies around the world. It costs very little compared to the huge amounts spent on the military or in commercial transactions, and yet is the most sacred and the most important tasks of the United Nations, because it incorporates victims from around the world. It also recognizes nature as a victim, and also it cares for future generations that have the right to live in dignity. Peace between the state and the FARC guerrilla group in Colombia, which was achieved thanks to an agreement signed and thanks to transitional justice, has led to very positive and very important changes to my country and has given our society a new hope in spite of a whole range of difficulties. I'm going to touch upon 5 points. First of all, the victims. Second, truth in transitional justice. The third point will be non-repetition. Fourth, comprehensive transition. And fifth, the Security Council and the international community. Now, the victims. First of all, the victims of armed conflicts are the very raison d'etre of transitional justice that is driven by the pain and the human tragedy involved in order to seek solutions of coexistence and reconciliation. Now, in the conflict in Colombia, that conflict lasted some 50 years until November of 2016. In that conflict, about 240,000 civilians died, and there are almost 9 million victims that have been recognized. And the continual scream of communities that have been victimized was and always has been, stop the war on all sides. In all countries in transition, this transition starts with the ceasefire and making of peace, and then it continues throughout a long and difficult process of peace building, where the most important actors are the victims. Now, the transitional justice allows victims not only to obtain reparations, but to be recognized as citizens with full political and social rights in their own countries and around the world. Now, the second point is truth. Truth has become the gateway for transitional justice and the foundation for the collective construction of a shared future in countries that have been divided by war. Transitional justice has become more and more developed, and it has various institutions that come together as a system to work on 3 types of truths. The first truth is a judicial truth, and in Colombia that is in the hands of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which is in charge of ensuring that there will be no impunity. Now, it's a truth that determines who's guilty under the law and pronounces sentences. It is made up of testimonies from victims and culprits. The victims participate in the sentence and the punishment. Punishment is not revenge, but rather clearly defining the victims and the victimizers. An example of this in my country is the sentence requested by the victims for the former guerrilla fighters. They demanded that they tell the truth and acknowledge responsibilities in the crime, in the killing of 11 deputies of a territorial assembly carried out by the FARC. And the culprits must serve 8 years of restricted freedom and build with their own hands a school for 2,000 children. Now, the second type of truth is a moral, historical, and social truth. And it is up to the Truth Commission to search for this truth. It's a truth that is not really built, but rather that is uncovered, that until it becomes evident and cannot be maintained in silence. It's a kind of truth that comes from the testimony of the victims from all sides, and where you ask why the events took place and the reason for the violent processes, and calls on a reflection and a search to try to understand the tragedy with the goal of building a new future, whether it's in Colombia, Peru, Guatemala, Sierra Leone, or Mali. It's a kind of truth without any kind of political or economic interests, that strives for the greatest possible independence, and that does not condemn anyone individually, but rather determines responsibilities in terms of public ethics. It's a kind of truth that listens to the various actors in a conflict and compares various opinions and interpretations. It's not to single out or fuel hatred, but rather to overcome social divisions based on a painful but liberating truth. Lastly, there is the third type of truth, the one that is dealt with by the unit that searches for disappeared persons, that supports families in the most cruel and concrete forms of destroying a human being, making him or her disappear forever. In Colombia, this kind of truth is very concrete because there are some 100,000 people who have been disappeared or disappeared. Now, the third point I want to touch upon is the non-repetition. This is a legacy of the Truth Commissions and their contribution to the transition. It is made up of a number of programs so that an armed conflict is never repeated. It's a kind of legacy that is in the hands of the various social groups and institutions of the state, of social society, and the actors who were involved in the war. To achieve non-repetition, what is essential is public acts of recognition of the dignity of victims and acceptance of responsibility by the culprits. An example of this was established by South Africa. Today in Colombia, this is being done. And I'm going to tomorrow to Medellin in one of these kinds of ceremonies. Last week, the former guerrilla fighters of FARC apologized for a terrorist attack in which a bomb killed 36 people and left 196 wounded in a very important social club some 17 years ago in Bogota. To make sure that non-repetition is achieved, what's necessary is a process of coexistence in communities that were divided by war. For example, in a small town, a small village of Riachuelo in my country that seeks reconciliation after an event where paramilitary fighters converted children, boys and girls, in a high school in targets of sexual abuse, and the community faced the brutal and overwhelming power of armed fighters. Thousands of communities around the world need to achieve reconciliation so that the children of the future don't have to experience the violent rivalries that their grandparents experienced due to the conflict. Now, the fourth point is a comprehensive transition. This is a process where the state and the rebels fully comply with the agreement signed, the peace agreement. Comprehensive transition means caring for the lives of the former combatants and reintegrating them, all of them, with dignity in a society. It demands to carry out with foresight and determination over many years processes of cultural, economic, and political change in the institutions and processes that gave rise to the conflict. It requires political determination by the governments that must comply fully with the agreement signed by the state and go beyond until all the political violence has been left in the past. When there are new governments that have not signed the agreement signed by the state, and they are not, they don't wholeheartedly support what was agreed and create doubts on the transition underway. In society, we're seeing polarization increase that we had during the war. These kinds of situations put at risk the energy and the boldness that is necessary for a transition, and they undermine the programs that former combatants and that former combatants are involved in, and that where communities are trying to overcome the past. Fortunately, when the comprehensive process of transition is in the hands of civil society, especially young people, no one can stop it. And this is very important. No one can really stop it once young people get involved, because people cannot give up peace once they have tasted the joy of living without having to experience terror all the time. Now, the fifth point is the Security Council and the international community and their role. They have a very important role in transitional justice. Peace is the responsibility of the citizens of a nation. However, there are cases that require transitional justice, and these represent a rupture in the normal way of things. This is why it's essential for the international community to be committed, because in conflicts there are external links and dynamics there that no country can control by itself. Transitional justice is based on very high international ethics. It is at the very heart of the human tragedy, and it requires an accumulated apprenticeship and learning on the best practices to make sure that restorative justice prevails over simple criminal justice. It's important to put human beings above any kind of other purpose or goal in this kind of process. Without this kind of international support, it would not have been possible to put an end to the war in countries that have been that are on the agenda of this council. Nor would it have been possible to achieve peace and transition in Colombia, that have seen the participation of the verification mission of the United Nations, the Organization of American States missions, and the constant solidarity of the community of nations, and the wholehearted and united support of the Security Council. Nations that are undergoing transitional justice are moving towards peace and have put their trust in you, and would like to express their gratitude. Thank you. Thank you, Father Rue, for your statement. Now I give the floor to Yasmina Suka.
Your Excellencies, I would like to thank the Belgian government for inviting me to participate in this important open debate on transitional justice. I come from a country where during the years of apartheid, scores of detainees were said to have jumped out of windows at police headquarters, hanged themselves in cells, died hitting their heads against police filing cabinets, or fatally slipping on bars of soap. Inquests held under the apartheid system found nobody responsible for their deaths. 2 decades after South Africa's transitional justice process, these inquests are at last being reopened, and families now have hopes for justice. I would like to know how and why he died, said Jill Berger, the sister of trade union activist and Dr. Neil Agate, 2 weeks ago when she testified at the reopened inquest. The apartheid state responsible for his death in custody found that he had hung himself in his cell. Many of those who were detained and tortured during that period are now speaking out about their torture at the hands of South Africa's notorious apartheid security branch. The reopened inquest is a symbol of hope for countless victims and their families all over the world in their long, arduous struggle for truth and justice. The reopened inquest in South Africa and the latest report that Umar al-Bashir may be transferred to the International Criminal Court to face genocide and war crimes charges demonstrates the importance of addressing impunity, which is directly linked to restoring the rule of law as a prerequisite for national healing and reconciliation. Transitional justice suggests the drawing of a line between the past and the future. However, even the best processes often exclude many people who are not yet ready to speak or who have not been given the opportunity to speak about their pain. Like in my own country, it can take decades to deliver justice, and often the quest for the truth will be driven by the families of victims, assisted by a handful of determined civil society actors assisting them. I was fortunate to be part of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established in 1995 by Nelson Mandela, South Africa's first democratically elected president. South Africa's process was deeply influenced by the Latin American experiences of building accountability while at the same time ensuring stability and the continuance of the new government. As an actor in the process, I was, however, deeply conscious always of the limitations of the narrow mandate, which did not allow us to consider structural violations. The principles to combat impunity developed by Louis Joinet and later updated by Diane Orentlicher advanced the field of transitional justice, as Joinet posited that states are primarily responsible for ensuring that victims and their families are able to realize their inalienable right to truth, justice, and reparations. Joinet transformed transitional justice from a technocratic process of one-size-fits-all to a holistic approach which is context-specific, inclusive, and participatory, and centralizes the rights of victims. Joinet's work was premised on the recognition that gross human rights violations and atrocity crimes are rooted in state structures which manifest unequal power asymmetries and which shape contexts of extreme violence and repression. African experiences have also challenged the narrow focus on civil and political rights violations in light of the legacies of violence and structural violations arising from their colonial histories and wars of liberation, including land dispossession, corruption, and economic crimes. Earlier transitional justice processes also ignored the gender dimension of conflict, but has been emancipated by transitional justice processes adopted in countries like Sierra Leone, Peru, and more recently Tunisia, where they adopted a gender lens, deliberately focusing on the inclusion and participation of women and girls. When they were consulted on the recommendations of the Truth Commission, rural women in Sierra Leone asked the Commission to ensure that the government allocate a percentage of the funds it received from the heavily indebted Poor Countries Fund towards the secondary education of their girl children, since most families, poor families, prioritize the education of boys. The women also recommended that the government implement constitutional reforms to improve their legal status, regardless of whether they had been married under Islamic law or customary law. The work of the Truth and Dignity Commission in Tunisia has been groundbreaking, including ensuring an independent budget to facilitate the inclusion and participation of women and girls. Accountability for conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence remains, however, a challenge at both the domestic and international levels. My experiences in investigating sexual and gender-based violence has convinced me of the importance of understanding the role that gender norms play in the fostering of violence and human rights abuses. Sexual and gender-based violence is too often still framed narrowly as a matter of gender identity, with insufficient attention given to its causes. This obscures the fact that the drivers of conflict-related sexual violence are similar, irrespective of the victim's identity. In fact, the evidence shows that perpetrators use prescribed gender roles to punish and terrorize women and employ the same tactics to humiliate and emasculate men. Focusing on women and girls is critical, but ignoring the violations perpetrated against men and boys limits our analysis of how gender norms fuels the use of sexual violence in conflict and stymies our efforts at prevention. This is evidenced by the testimony that is emerging from many war zones. But fragile states emerging from conflict have not always been able to implement the ambitious transitional justice programs they adopt. In many instances, they lack technical capacity and often the political will to do what is necessary. In both of these instances, the United Nations should be required to provide vital support for the implementation of such processes. And of course, since 2004, the UN Security Council has referred to or prescribed rule of law and transitional justice interventions in more than 60 resolutions. For example, the transitional justice-related role of peacekeeping missions, such as UNMISS in South Sudan, MINUSCA in Central Africa, MINUSMA in Mali, has been critical for international peace and security. Peacekeeping operations are also the best fora to promote transitional justice through their support programs for the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants, and also institution building contributing to prevention. A recent report by the Security Council report, an NGO, focuses on how impunity has been responsible for some of the world's most devastating conflicts, exploring in great detail 4 country situations: Myanmar, Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. The report notes that ending impunity is not only a matter of principle, but for the Council is also a practical tool to maintain international peace and security. Lack of action on accountability in conflicts where mass crimes are committed risks hampering the Council's ability to address and resolve these conflicts more broadly in a way that ensures long-term stability and avoids the resumption of conflict. Continental bodies like the African Union have also begun to play a critical role in promoting transitional justice, as evidenced by the African Union's role in 2006 in the prosecution of Hassan Habre, the former president of Chad. The AU and IGAD have also been instrumental in facilitating the peace process for South Sudan, as well as the revitalized peace agreement. African Union member states also recently adopted the AU's transitional justice policy on the 12th of February 2019. This policy is meant to guide member states to achieve sustainable peace, justice, reconciliation, social cohesion, and healing after experiencing mass atrocities. While the policy is to be welcomed, we should remember, however, that policies alone cannot substitute for the lack of political will to deal with accountability for grave crimes. The Security Council's 5th report explores in great detail the response by various organs of the United Nations to the crisis in the 4 countries mentioned, but notes that the UN Security Council has yet been unable either to bring justice to victims or seriously affect the cause of the conflict. The Security Council must address impunity using a prevention lens to ensure the non-recurrence of violations, but also needs to address the indirect causes of conflict or factors that exacerbate conflict, namely structural violence, discrimination, economic exploitation, unequal power relations, and climate justice. In crafting the road ahead, the Council needs to be more innovative, taking decisive approaches towards current conflicts on its agenda, but in concert with other UN bodies, including the Human Rights Council, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the General Assembly, and continental bodies such as the African Union, as to enhance legitimacy as well as effectiveness in maintaining international peace and security. This is true, too, for a continental body like the African Union if we are to silence the guns by 2020. As we take forward a transitional justice agenda, it is essential to ensure that peace and justice are seen as mutually reinforcing imperatives and not replaced by erroneous notions that peace must come first before accountability. Prevention and building sustainable peace requires that we address mass atrocity crimes, which are the legacies of violent conflict, and restore the trust deficit between the state and its citizens so that the state works for all citizens, irrespective of ethnicity, religion, gender, and race. While we have to acknowledge the constraints we operate under, we must also focus our efforts on ensuring that victims and their families are able to access justice and have their dignity restored. I thank you.
Je remercie Madame Souka de
I thank Ms. Suka for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Defence of the Kingdom of Belgium. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, how can we reconcile and rebuild a society after mass atrocities and massive human rights violations? These events destabilize entire communities and families. Their consequences are generally felt over several decades or even generations. The three accounts we heard today illustrate these challenges, but also give us prospects for solutions. Transitional justice is a set of measures intended to respond to this difficult past. It covers the entire scope of tools in order to try to provide to victims truth, justice, and reparations, with the purpose of preventing repetition of future conflicts or atrocities. The Security Council plays an important role in this area. Peace operations can help states to strengthen their capacities and reform their public institutions in order to reestablish the rule of law. After almost 30 years, they have contributed to implementing transitional justice measures. Many, if not all, of these processes have had a significant impact on the populations concerned by giving them a certain form of justice which they would not have been able to access otherwise. For my country, it is clear that establishing responsibility for human rights violations and the most serious crimes is essential in order to restore confidence of the population in inclusive institutions and thus reaching a lasting peace. Peace and justice should not be seen as opposing goals, but to the contrary, are mutually reinforcing. In accordance with the principle of complementarity, the ICC can also have a role to play side by side with national transitional justice measures in cases where the state concerned does not have the will or is unable to truly conduct inquiries or prosecutions. But implementing transitional justice is complex and it has many challenges. The risk is often falling into a justice of the victors. Some measures, particularly the restoration of a criminal justice system, can be very costly and imply a timeline that does not respond to immediate challenges. Also, the financial means required for the process of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration can appear to be inadequate when it comes to the expectations of the victims for reparations. The sequence of measures is thus essential for a successful transition. Mechanisms such as truth commissions and the vetting process are sometimes more appropriate than criminal prosecutions when the post-conflict situation is still precarious, although some of these measures can later facilitate prosecutions. This is why when the Security Council adopts measures to support the transitional justice process, it should be sure not to adopt a generic focus. We should concentrate our action on clear objectives, taking the specific context of each situation into account. Some guidelines can nevertheless emerge on the basis of many experiences over the past 30 years. Thus, let me stress the following points. First, an approach covering all aspects of transitional justice is essential in order to avoid the four pillars making it up: truth, justice, reparation, and non-recurrence guarantees should develop independently of each other. These pillars are interdependent and complementary. They should also create synergies with other transition processes. A holistic approach is therefore essential. The Security Council has a role to play in this regard. The process of transitional justice must be under national ownership. For example, we've seen that the lack of physical proximity of some criminal mechanisms can make the support of the population difficult. Awareness campaigns are therefore essential. The needs and demands of the victims must be at the core of the process of transitional justice. The victims should be recognized as rights holders and included in the definition of measures decided by national authorities. Fourth, the inclusive nature of the process increases its effectiveness. Particular attention must be given to the most vulnerable victims, and this should be done from the creation of the transitional justice programs by organizing national consultations involving victims and civil society. The process of transitional justice must also include a gender perspective. The voices of women often are ignored when establishing a version of past events. Lastly, transitional justice is an essential tool to make peace and sustainable development possible. It must take into account the deep causes of these conflicts. Here are some of the key principles to guide the Council in its efforts to support the process of transitional justice. I hail the presence of a large number of members of the United Nations who have come to share their experiences and suggestions, and I welcome their contribution to this debate. I'd like to quote Secretary General Guterres. Reconciliation, truth, justice, and reconciliation are all parts of transitional justice. Thank you. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Kala Ankaraou, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Cooperation, African Integration, Nigeria Abroad of Niger.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to congratulate Belgium on taking up the presidency of the Council. This is the first time that I'm taking the floor here. And I would like to assure Belgium the full support of my delegation. And I would like to also express my satisfaction with the choice of this topic, which is extremely relevant due to the importance attached by the international community to transitional justice in periods of conflict and post-conflict, and in particular in Africa. Mr. President, in his report in 2004 on the rule of law and transitional justice, the UN Secretary General stated, and I quote, "Dealing with the past aims to determine responsibilities, do justice, and enable reconciliation," end of quote. Along the same line, I would like to just recall the words of current Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who during a public debate in the Security Council in 2018 said, and I quote, "Reconciliation cannot be a substitute for justice, nor can it open the way for amnesty for the most serious crimes," end of quote. This is why, Mr. President, I remain convinced that it is obviously necessary to promote reconciliation, but it's just as important to break the cycle of impunity, especially in extreme situations where there have been massacres. Indeed, resorting to transitional justice and implementing a process of true reconciliation contributes to preventing the resumption of conflicts and makes it possible to resolve them in a lasting fashion. Mr. President, bearing this in mind, Niger supports the actions of the United Nations in the area of transitional justice, in particular those actions that aim specifically to ensure peace building and sustaining peace. Niger will always support efforts of political missions and those of country offices of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that strive to strengthen trust between the population and the security forces, as well as that are aimed at building peace after conflicts. Now, since we've been in conflict with the terrorist groups that are attacking our populations along some of our borders, Niger has created a High Authority for Peacebuilding. It's an entity which has been tasked with the mission of ensuring that essential needs of victims are met, and that in particular those who are victims of severe human rights violations, and to ensure transitional justice and to establish an atmosphere of trust between the population and the security forces. This entity has benefited from the strong support of the UN system and other partners, and it has achieved significant successes, and we're very happy about that. Mr. President, Niger supports Resolution 70/262 of the General Assembly and Resolution 2282 of the Security Council, which in particular stress the fundamental importance of transitional justice in in efforts of sustaining peace. Niger, at the same time, endorses the policy of transitional justice of the African Union adopted in February of 2019, and regarding which the chair of the commission, Mr. Moussa Faki Mahamat, stated, transitional justice is essential for the promotion of human rights and justice, of peace and security, of good governance and development, end of quote. And Niger notes on this point the importance for the African Union to draw upon an authentically African transitional justice that has a wealth of progressive approaches and methodologies, and that is rooted in values, shared African values, in African systems of transitional justice, and in African experiences. Thank you very much for your attention.
Je remercie Son Excellence.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Ankurau, for his statement. And now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Mart Volmer, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Estonia.
Thank you very much. Estonia thanks the Kingdom of Belgium for organizing today's open debate and all the briefers for their interventions. Mr. President, if we intend transitional justice mechanism to truly heal grief-stricken communities, the measures taken need to be comprehensive, coherent, locally owned, and based on international law. Based on our own national experience, and indeed we have been there, in order to overcome the harmful legacy of mass atrocity crimes, it is vital to build strong institutions capable of preserving rule of law and ensuring human rights for all. After regaining independence in 1991, Estonia re-established rule of law and reinstated democratic institutions in conformity with international legal standards and obligations. At the same time, bringing to justice perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during the occupation by the repressive regime. Estonia has been active in sharing the experience and lessons learned in this process, including by providing capacity building in Eastern Partnership region of Europe and programs relating to good governance, in particular e-governance, cybersecurity in all regions of the world. Estonia has further assisted women to gain livelihood and to provide children with education opportunities in various conflict and post-conflict situations throughout development cooperation initiatives. Today, we can hardly imagine a community being whole without the empowerment and full and equal participation of women in all stages of rebuilding the societies. We also have to ensure the engagement of children in justice and reconciliation processes. Mr. President, if we want communities to be peaceful and resilient, it is critical to acknowledge the past violations and to have redressed the victims. No one can remain above the law. If authorities are unable or unwilling to fulfill their primary responsibility of bringing perpetrators of the most serious crimes to justice, and there is no other criminal accountability mechanism set up, it is the International Criminal Court as a complementary judicial institution that assists states in bringing about justice for past crimes. Estonia welcomes recent reports of Sudan's commitment to cooperate with the ICC and readiness to hand over all 5 suspects to the ICC to face charges of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. This would really constitute a significant step in the pursuit of justice, since the UN Security Council first ever referred of a situation to the ICC in March 15 years ago. As the road to justice may be long and winding, it is also vital to collect and preserve evidence of atrocities already during the conflicts and ensure their usefulness for possible future justice mechanisms. In this regard, Estonia strongly supports international independent fact-finding and evidence preservation efforts, including in Syria and Myanmar. Mr. President, we acknowledge the role of the United Nations in enhancing the sustainability of transitional justice processes. In a post-conflict situation, the UN should be able to provide a smooth transition from humanitarian relief to reconciliation, from OCHA to UNDP. We further welcome consolidation of accountability efforts with regard to country situations so that all transitional justice mechanisms would be able to work cohesively. At the same time, all UN activities need to systematically incorporate rule of law aspects. We appreciate the work of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights as the lead entity of the UN on transitional justice issues. Mr. President, we would like to conclude by calling on transitional justice measures to be better examined and utilized also in the area of prevention of mass atrocity crimes. We underline the role of the Security Council in upholding and promoting transitional justice by responding decisively to early warning signs of grave violations of international law, including that of humanitarian law and human rights law, in order to prevent and mitigate human suffering. We look forward to a more consistent UN record on concrete actions in the field of atrocity prevention. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Vollmer, for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, our delegation wishes to thank you for convening this important debate on transitional justice as a building block towards sustaining peace. We extend our thanks to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the President of the Commission for Truth, Coexistence and Non-Repetition in Colombia, Mr. Francisco de Roo, and Ms. Jasmine Suka, Director of the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa, and their insightful briefing. We also welcome, Mr. President, all the ministers and deputy ministers present today. South Africa recognizes and values the importance of national transitional justice processes in achieving sustaining peace. In our own, as Mayor Jasmine Suka said, transitional justice was a vital cog in securing a relatively peaceful transition from apartheid to a stable constitutional democracy we are today. To this end, it is important to know that this debate takes place shortly after our country's marked 30th anniversary of the release from imprisonment of one of the most notable champions of transitional justice and reconciliation, former President Nelson Mandela, and a global icon of our struggle. Former President Mandela and his leadership collective recognized early, as the time of his release from 27 years imprisonment, that national reconciliation rather than vengeance and retributive justice could be the only valuable foundation on which sustainable peace in a democratic South Africa could be constructed. However, the sustainable peace which former President Mandela and his colleagues sought to build did not have the narrow goal of just ending conflict, but aimed at the political, security, social, and economic dimension of society emerging from conflict. This included addressing the root causes of the conflict and promoting social and economic justice, as well as putting into place political structures of governance and the rule of law to have consolidated peace building, reconciliation, and development. Mr. President, South Africa knows that transitional justice has an enormous role to play in countries evolved from conflict situation and peace building. This could necessarily entail that the whole spectrum of transitional justice be employed, including criminal prosecutions, truth commissions, reparation and restitutional programs, exhumation of the mass graves, apologies, amnesty, and various kinds of institutional reforms to redress human rights abuses. Such a process should, however, not follow a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather respond to the specific context of the country concerned. For South Africa, the restorative justice approach we choose through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission sought to combat impunity and recreate a culture of accountability, uncover the truth about gross human rights violations, and assist families of the victims to get in closure. The TRC also had the broad strategic objectives of promoting national unity and reconciliation in a spirit of understanding which transcend the conflict and division of the past. Regrettably, South Africa's experience of a repressive regime is not unique. In many countries emerging from authoritarian rule and conflict, also suffers extensive human rights violations and often crimes heinous nature. Where atrocities were committed on such a widespread scale, holding individual perpetrators accountable may not be possible or the most desirable result. Whilst ensuring justice by means of individual accountability is an important mechanism to achieve peace, it often overlooks the complexity of the conflict and the structural nature of violence. It thus fails to address the broader structural challenges that likely contributed to violence in the first place, and which may very cause of state to fall back into conflict. Mr. President, South Africa is of the view the United Nations should be able to provide more support to national transitional justice processes through peace missions, peacebuilding commission, and the other UN structures and representation. The UN Security Council has an important role to play in promoting sustaining peace through transitional justice by encouraging adherence to international guidelines and regional policies. Healing, however, comes from within and cannot be imposed from without. It is therefore important that ownership of transitional justice processes is not appropriated by international community. Transitional justice must be driven by those emerging from conflict themselves and tailored to their circumstances in order to ensure that it will be result in long-lasting peace. Mr. President, in February 2019, the African Union adopted its transitional justice policy to assist African Union member states to develop their own context-specific comprehensive policy strategies and programs towards democratic and socio-economic transformation and achieving sustainable peace, justice, reconciliation, social cohesion, and healing. It thus serves as a guide for countries to develop comprehensive policy while maintaining national ownership, which is imperative to ensure that the international justice process will be successful. As a newly elected chair of the African Union for 2020, South Africa will, in line with the AU collective aspiration to silence the guns on the African continent, focus its efforts on conflict resolution across the African continent. This includes supporting international justice processes in our peace-building efforts. In this regard, South Africa will continue to advocate for AU-UN cooperation. Mr. President, as we witness the drawdown of peacekeeping missions and see the regional transition countries from conflict to post-conflict situations, South Africa wishes to highlight the importance of including reconciliation through transitional justice in holistic, comprehensive transitional plans. This includes taking into account community-based justice mechanisms and ensure that the most vulnerable, including women and youth in particular, are represented in these processes. Grassroots populations and conflict-ridden regions generally tend to be worst affected by scourge of conflict. Transitional justice thus needs to involve the active participation of all sectors of society. The role of women should also be not underestimated. The African Union Transitional Policy, for instance, promotes the incorporation of women representation and participation in the transitional processes by including their participation extensively in peace agreements, laws, and policies. Mr. President, there has been less attention dedicated to the local grassroots participation and inclusiveness of security sector reforms in post-conflict situations. While there is expansive and commendable literature in the field of security sector reform, there is scant scrutiny on the role of locals in the form of youth, women, traditional leaders, chiefs, community-based, village-based organization, the security sector reform processes, thereby rendering the methods and approaches to be elite-focused and driven. High efforts should thus seek to contribute to United Nations support for local-driven and locally generated security sector reforms as part of enhancing peace dividend and reinforcing strategic pillars to avoid relapse. One of the greatest challenges in international justice is institutions reform. It is thus imperative that institutions that were previously the instrument of repression are restructured for the good of society so as to create trust between victims and the institutions. Equally, new progressive institutions should also be established with a view of strengthening, consolidating, and safeguarding peace and democratic governance in order to avoid potential relapse into conflict. As former President Nelson Mandela said himself, I want to quote, "Peace is not just the absence of conflict. Peace is the creation of an environment where all can flourish, regardless of race, color, creed, religion, gender, class, caste, or any social market differences." Thank you, Mr. President.
I want to thank the representative of South Africa for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Foreign Minister Goffin, and thank you to all of our briefers today. However, before beginning my remarks today, I must take a moment to raise a point of profound concern for my government. This is the release yesterday by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of a database of companies operating in or connected to Israeli settlements in the West Bank. High Commissioner Bachelet, we are astonished and deeply disappointed by your decision. The United States has long opposed the creation or release of this database, which was mandated by the discredited UN Human Rights Council in 2016. Its publication only confirms the unrelenting anti-Israel bias so prevalent at the United Nations. The United States has not provided and will never provide any information to the Office of the High Commissioner to support compilation of these lists. We further express our support for the U.S. companies referenced. We call upon all UN member states to join us in rejecting this effort, which facilitates the discriminatory boycott, divestment, and sanction, BDS, campaign and delegitimizes Israel. Attempts to isolate Israel run counter to all of our efforts to build conditions conducive to Israeli-Palestinian negotiations that lead to a comprehensive and enduring peace. Mr. President, returning to today's briefing, it has been nearly 7 years since the Council met to discuss specifically the critical issue of transitional justice. So we very much appreciate and thank Belgium for calling and chairing such an important discussion. Security Council Resolution 2282 calls for comprehensive approaches to transitional justice, and we recognize the vital role transitional justice plays in uncovering difficult truths, acknowledging abuses, and fostering reconciliation. UN tribunals can play an integral role in this regard, and we call for more equitable burden sharing in financially supporting these courts. Transitional justice must be tailored to local circumstances, with communities playing a central role in its design and implementation. It must incorporate the perspectives of victims and survivors, including religious or ethnic minorities and civil society. Transitional justice is also a political process. Political leaders have a pivotal role to play in setting the tone for justice and accountability during transitions. They should develop a public record of abuses, reform security sectors responsible for abuses, and reintegrate those members of the forces into society. Transitional justice processes must be nationally owned, inclusive processes that account for victims' needs. It is imperative that women and girls' needs are reflected in transitional justice mechanisms, which will help address the unique barriers to women's participation in peace processes and transitional justice initiatives. This is imperative because women's direct participation in peace negotiations increases the sustainability of peace agreements. We know the characteristics of effective transitional justice measures. Our task is to ensure that they animate our pursuit of justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators. Further, when considering transitional justice strategies, we must take the country's existing legal and institutional structures into account. In South Sudan, the people have told us there that there can be no peace without justice. We call on South Sudan's leaders to implement all aspects of their peace agreement, including those related to transitional justice. The establishment of the AU Hybrid Court for South Sudan is critical to securing lasting peace in a country devastated by conflict. And this is why we contributed $4 million to the African Union to help create this institution, which will uphold the rule of law, accountability, and justice. We would also like to recognize the comprehensive approach to transitional justice implemented in the Central African Republic. There, the Peacebuilding Fund supported the latest AU-led peace process, ensuring that it linked back to the inclusive, consultative process of the Bangui Forum in 2015. We were pleased that some women-led civil society groups were consulted in the peace agreement, but are concerned that no women were signatories. MINUSCA has supported the vetting of security forces and a comprehensive assessment of past human rights abuses and atrocities, all of which enabled transitional justice and security sector reform efforts to proceed. UNDP has worked to build the capacity of the Central African Police, Justice, and Corrections institutions with funding from the U.S. Department of State, shoring up government institutions to support justice and accountability in CAR. And we have seen the creation and implementation of the Special Criminal Court. This comprehensive UN approach has supported several key components of transitional justice in CAR. The United States is committed to supporting all efforts that ensure coherent, comprehensive, and integrated UN approaches to transitional justice. We underscore that transitional justice processes must be nationally owned, inclusive, and gender-sensitive to fully account for the needs of victims. The Council and the UN can rely on the United States' full support for transitional justice initiatives, and together we can ensure that the voices of survivors and victims are heard, that their needs are met, and that their dignity is honored. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Belgium for convening this open debate on transitional justice, and also to thank the briefers. I also would like to welcome the presence of ministers of Niger, Spain, Guatemala, as well as the Deputy Foreign Ministers of Estonia. Indonesia aligns itself with the statement to be made by Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, countries emerging from conflicts are often confronted with numerous challenges in building and sustaining peace. These include the provision of justice for victims of conflict and the promotion of reconciliation. Addressing these complex issues, while not easy, is a key requisite to achieving a durable and prosperous peace. In this context, allow me to share the following three pertinent points. First, transitional justice process should be forward-looking. It is not only about addressing past grievances. The process, crucially, must also lay foundation for reconciliation and rebuild trust in society, while avoiding repetition. Thus, a forward-looking approach will help the countries in moving forward sustainable peace and development. Indeed, transitional justice process should become part and parcel of broader peace building and sustaining peace. And since each country has its own particular context, needs, and capacities, there is no one-size-fits-all strategy. A nationally determined, comprehensive approach is required for transitional justice to be successful. Second, transitional justice must be nationally owned and inclusive. All elements of the society must be substantially consulted and involved in the design and implementation of transnational justice process. This is to ensure a sense of national ownership, which is essential for long-term effectiveness of transitional justice. Women must play a central role in this process. Their voices should be heard carefully. Indonesia is a strong advocate of women's robust role in the whole continuum of peace process. As part of this commitment, Indonesia is currently working on the establishment of a regional network of women negotiators and mediators. We will continue to amplify the voice for greater participation of women in peace processes. Third, comprehensive reform is essential. Countries in transition often face capacity challenges in political, legal, security, and socio-economic sectors. To address this issue, countries need to seek solutions beyond institutional reform. While we recognize the importance of supporting countries for building their capacities in effective rule of law, governance, and related areas, it is also crucial to build their economic resiliences against recurrence of conflict. Among its initiatives, Indonesia organized an international workshop on crops for peace last year. It provided a platform for sharing of best practices on agriculture-based economic development in post-conflict countries. At the global level, Indonesia also continues to render its contribution to the United Nations peacekeeping operation with a view to ensuring coherence in supporting the nationally driven transitional justice process. Mr. President, to conclude, while everyone must contribute, the Security Council should play a greater role in effectively supporting countries in transition to build and sustain peace. Indonesia reiterates that justice, reconciliation, and economic development should be pursued hand in hand. The different activities surrounding transitional justice should pave the way to welfare and prosperity, with the long term of building a durable peace, putting the human approach in the forefront while protecting humanity and giving hope for future generations. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Indonésie.
I thank Indonesia for your statement, and I now give the floor to Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me, first of all, to thank the briefers and to welcome the ministers present here today. I also thank the Kingdom of Belgium for having organized this meeting. We hope that it will make it possible for us to have a fruitful exchange of experiences and opinions on the process of transitional justice in order to benefit best practices and to share the lessons learned. And we can thus have an overview of what the Council can do to move forward in the service of international peace and security. Many countries in the world, Mr. President, have experienced different experiences of transitional justice, particularly after conflicts or dictatorships. Although these experiences are numerous and diverse in nature, the reasons to move forward in the process of transitional justice are linked to the adoption of deep political changes after civil wars or periods of transition after revolutions against dictatorships. These are periods which can be characterized by far-ranging violations of freedoms and the physical and moral integrity of individuals. We believe that the objectives of transitional justice in every case are based on the common factors which are strengthening peace, political and social cohesiveness, and the fight against repetition of the conflict, as well as singling out those responsible for grave human rights violations. For peace building, it is difficult to succeed without transitional justice, which investigates past violations, which brings the truth to light, and which rehabilitates victims and their families, moving towards accountability and national reconciliation. In short, to turn the page on the past and to build reconciled societies that live in peace and harmony. If this is not done, violations will be the seed for discord and hatred which can undermine peace. After the revolution against the dictatorship in Tunisia, we experienced an important phase of transitional justice. Civil society played a preponderant role in pushing this process forward. And this happened at a very early stage, before the adoption of the Constitution of the Second Republic. Indeed, on 22 December 2013, the Organic Law 2013-53, organizing transitional justice, was adopted by the National Constituent Assembly. Transitional justice in Tunisia is inspired by comparable experiences and international human rights law references. It identifies transitional justice as an integrated process of mechanisms and implementing means in order to understand and address the past violations of human rights by revealing the truth, bringing perpetrators to account, compensating victims, restoring their rights to reach national reconciliation, preservation and documentation of collective memory, establishment of guarantees on non-repetition, the transition from authoritarianism to a proper democratic system. We established a truth commission to bring the truth to light and seek reconciliation. This independent body completed its work after 4 grueling years. Mr. President, the implementation of transitional justice mechanisms sometimes creates problems. However, these crises can be contained by using the political maturity of state institutions as a support, as well as counting on civil society participation in order to redress mistakes and achieve global reconciliation between citizens on the one hand and the institutional apparatus of the state on the other. There are no pre-established models for transitional justice. There cannot be any imposed prescriptions or legal focuses. We must not lose sight of the local social and political dynamics in order to fight violations and undertake societal changes which will make society more fair over the long term. In this area, the Security Council can encourage innovative focuses on transitional justice through reconstruction and reparation. These measures are inspired by the principles of local justice, whilst benefiting from the capacity and skills of international criminal justice. Tunisia supports strengthening international cooperation to reform law and institutions in post-conflict states and states emerging from dictatorships, for these laws to be in harmony with international law and international human rights law. Also, we support the ability to benefit from trust funds for victims provided by the Rome Statute, allowing the victims of severe violations in reparations for peace and stability. I thank Tunisia for this statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and may I join others in thanking Belgium for convening this important debate. Very pleased, High Commissioner, that you were able to join us and brief the Security Council, and maybe there are many more occasions where that might happen. And thank you also to our other 2 briefers. Mr. President, I'll make 3 short points. Firstly, I want briefly to state the reasons that the UK considers accountability for conflict-related crimes so important for peace and security. Second, I want to acknowledge some of the important developments in transitional justice policy and practice over the last 2 decades and their relevance beyond the traditionally understood transition cycle. And thirdly, I want to propose that for transitional justice to be more meaningful for sustaining peace, we need to find better ways and means of connecting it with social or socio-economic justice. Mr. President, on my first point, the United Kingdom believes that legal accountability for conflict-related crimes serves as deterrent, punishment, and a method for upholding victims' rights. Without it, there can be neither reconciliation of communities, nor faith in the functioning of rule of law institutions, nor respect for the rules-based international system. These are the principles for which my government stands. There should be no impunity for international crimes, no amnesty for gross violations. As a spokesman for the Sudanese government put it on Tuesday, justice cannot be achieved if we don't heal the wounds. And I want to welcome the government of Sudan's decision to hold former President Omar al-Bashir and others accountable, which would be a significant step towards peace settlement in Darfur. Victims of human rights violations in Myanmar also deserve justice. It is difficult to see how Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh can return to Rakhine State unless they are confident that the perpetrators, in particular the Burmese military, will be held accountable. Mr. President, on my second point, transitional justice began as an innovative way of enabling justice in post-conflict environments. Over the past 25 years, there have been significant developments in this field, and many of the representatives round the table, particularly South Africa and Tunisia, have set out some of these developments in their countries, which was very interesting. Mechanisms and processes have been increasingly inclusive and nationally owned. The consultative, inclusive, and independent manner in which the Gambia established its Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission has shown the benefits of national ownership to secure public confidence. I also want to welcome the recent verdict by the Bangui Court of Appeal in the Central African Republic, holding accountable 28 individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity related to the killing of 75 civilians and 10 United Nations peacekeepers in the Bangassou area. Transitional justice processes have assumed an increasingly victim-centered approach. More and more, efforts have been situated in broader institutional reform, including security sector reform. In Afghanistan, transitional justice initiatives have demonstrated what can be achieved in terms of local-level reconciliation, even prior to the signature of a comprehensive peace agreement. This breadth of application across such a range of issues has taught us that transitional justice has relevance far beyond the transition cycle traditionally associated with countries emerging from conflict. It can make inroads even amidst ongoing hostilities, and its toolkit can serve states and communities long after a conflict ends. Notwithstanding these developments, Mr. President, the time has come to have a critical conversation about what transitional justice has achieved in terms of building a peace that is sustainable and what more can be done. The root causes of conflict are persistent, and their manifestations are as adaptable as they are pernicious. This brings me to my final point, Mr. President. We now possess evidence that unless there is a proper response to deal with wider social and economic injustices, the root causes of conflict are highly capable of morphing into other forms of violence and discrimination further down the line. Not only does this risk the achievements of transitional justice being reduced to little more than lip service in the eyes of those affected by conflict, as they continue to experience a wide array of injustices in their daily lives, it presents a real risk of further cycles of conflict and insecurity. As transitional justice policy and practice continue to evolve, we should start to forge closer links with broader challenges to peace, justice, and inclusion. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Kenya and Tunisia have shown impressive results in this space, demonstrating that transitional justice mechanisms and mandates are well positioned to make an increasing contribution to addressing the root causes of conflict. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante.
I want to thank the United Kingdom for her statement, and I give the floor to Germany.
Thank you. I would like to echo the expression of gratitude by colleagues to our briefers. Delighted to see the High Commissioner briefing the Council. You have our full support, and we are looking forward to listen to more briefings from you in the very near future. Mr. President, colleagues and the briefers have eloquently elaborated on the importance of transitional justice. Let me share with you an example of our recent past. In 1991, in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall and in the process of reunification, the so-called State Security Records Agency was established in Germany. The task of this agency was to manage, research, and most importantly, make accessible files documenting how the GDR authorities spied on its citizens. People were able to obtain hundreds, even thousands of pages of the files in which the state security recorded details of their personal lives. And people were also able to obtain the names of those who passed on information that could lead to incarceration, to torture, or even to more severe consequences. Perhaps some of you have seen the movie The Life of Others, the Oscar award-winning movie that addresses in particular this issue. If you haven't seen it, I can strongly recommend it. The shocking findings by opening these files led to further measures. The German Parliament set up 2 commissions aiming at the reconciliation of society, to create a framework for coming to terms with the GDR past, to give back to the people their right to informational self-determination, to strengthen democratic education and dialogue with the public, and support the development of a common political culture. These commissions, as well as the agency, helped to retain the subject in the public debate, and it was no coincidence that the head of the State Security Records Agency, Joachim Gauck, later became the German president. Mr. President, what are the lessons that we have learned from our own experience? Transitional justice should have a survivor-centered approach, and I can just echo what the ambassador of the UK has said. It should not limit itself to punishing perpetrators, but also respond to the needs of the individuals affected, their families and networks, and lastly, the needs and perceptions of communities. This holds especially true for the most egregious crimes against the vulnerable, such as sexual and gender-based violence. Resolution 2467, therefore, for the first time introduced a survivor-centered approach. In the search for reconciliation, it is equally important to establish accountability and to fight against impunity. Holding those who are individually responsible for atrocities and human rights violations accountable under criminal law is a key prerequisite for sustaining peace. Therefore, Germany is a strong supporter of the International Criminal Court, as well as the investigative mechanisms mandated by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. National ownership can only be guaranteed by the inclusion of all, most importantly marginalized groups, civil society, and by the promotion and protection of everyone's human rights. Transitional justice on the local level must be embedded into a broader national discourse and policies. And I listened with great interest to the very inspiring statement of Francisco de Roo about the peace process in Colombia. Through project funding, Germany supports the peace process in Colombia and helps strengthening peace institutions involved in conflict resolution, such as the Special Court for Peace, the Truth Commission, and the Search Unit for Missing Persons through the German-Colombian Peace Institute, CAPAS. Mr. President, each country, each society, and each community should decide by themselves whether or not they need help and assistance from outside. If they do so, we should offer such assistance to the extent possible. To help national solutions to progress, we supported the DPPA UNDP program on peace and development advisors, who have proven to be very apt at supporting reconciliation processes. In this vein, we explicitly want to express our support for the UN toolbox. We need to strengthen the Security Council's focus on human rights, on conflict prevention, and the respective instruments. Reconciliation and mediation capacities must be included in missions' mandates more often. The Security Council should invite commissions mandated by the Human Rights Council to brief the Council on their efforts in collecting evidence and establishing a path to accountability. In South Sudan, for example, the Commission on Human Rights has a mandate critical for collecting and preserving evidence with a view to ending impunity and providing accountability, and to make such information available to all transitional justice mechanisms. Therefore, I very much welcome the participation of Ms. Yasmin Souka, the chief of this commission, in today's debate. This morning, we also heard that the transitional government in Khartoum has publicly apologized to the victims of the military rule. I think this is also a very positive signal for a reconciliation process in Sudan. Mr. President, the Peacebuilding Commission plays a crucial role in post-conflict situations as well as in prevention efforts. It contributes to the much-needed platform for cooperation, exchange, and sharing lessons both within and outside the UN. Germany wants the Peacebuilding Commission to make more frequent use of its expertise and advisory role also to the Security Council. The Security Council should also look at emerging conflicts more frequently and use mediation as a tool to prevent outbreaks, as called for by Article 33 of the UN Charter. The link between mediation and transitional justice needs to be reflected in the design of transition processes for peace and to be sustainable. Mr. President, no country can ever be guaranteed that violence and conflict are not reoccurring. Transitional justice has no end point. It is a constant endeavor that we have to undertake every single day in order to guard ourselves and the societies that we live in against sliding back into disaster. Assuming responsibility for our past, Germany is convinced that safeguarding the human rights of all and working towards more inclusive societies is the only way to achieve reconciliation and peace. Thank you.
I want to thank the representative of Germany for his statement, and I give the floor to France. Mr. President, I want to thank the High Commissioner for Human Rights for her statement, and I would also like to express our full trust in her work. I also want to thank Father Deroux and Madame Souka for their statements. I would like to touch upon 5 points. First of all, Colombian and South African experience illustrates something very clearly. No society can restore itself in a lasting way from a crisis if it ignores massive violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law. Any lasting peace involves establishing the truth on the atrocities perpetrated and recognizing a status for victims and establish individual and collective responsibilities and accountabilities. It is essential for the United Nations to help states in transition to tackle these challenges, starting from the stage of peace negotiations, and they must allocate necessary resources as part of resources earmarked for peace building and development. We salute the efforts of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who has the expertise to assist in defining a policy of transitional justice and implementing solutions, both judiciary and non-judiciary ones, adapted to the specificities of each national context without any dogmatic approach. In the Central African Republic, we encourage the High Commissioner to support the establishment of the Truth, Justice, Reparations, and Reconciliation Commission provided for in the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement signed a year ago. This body is a complement to building of an impartial and independent justice judiciary and it can meet the demands of justice expressed by the population of the CAR. And on this point, we're encouraged by the launch of investigations by the Special Criminal Court that France has supported by providing training to its magistrates. Second, all components of civil society must be involved in transitional justice. Women, who are the first victims of conflicts, must be involved in the design of a policy of transitional justice in accordance with Resolution 1325 and the Peace, Women and Security Agenda. Young people, historians, community and religious leaders, and the associations of victims must also play an active role. Strengthening democratic governance and education are also essential prerequisites. It is up to the states to allow the process of remembering to unfold and to combat revisionism. In the Balkans, where we're commemorating this year the 25th anniversary of the massacre of Srebrenica, it is unacceptable that political leaders are glorifying criminals of war and denying the crimes that have been proven by criminal courts established by this council. Thirdly, given that national transitional justice, for it to be effective, international mechanisms must support national efforts. Thanks to the mechanisms established to combat against crimes of Daesh in Iraq and the atrocities committed in Syria and Myanmar, the evidence will not disappear and crimes will not remain unpunished. And France would like to just recall its strong support for the International Criminal Court, which must play a key role in international efforts in combating impunity while respecting the principle of complementarity. We call on the universal ratification of the Rome Statute and welcome the states who have decided to join the International Criminal Court or cooperate with it in the framework of transition, as was the case of Tunisia in June of 2011 or Sudan today. The fourth point is the role granted to victims plays an essential role in the success in transitional justice. Establishing mechanisms for reparation and compensation of victims must be expanded. This is particularly the case of victims of sexual violence, who must receive medical, psychological, legal, social assistance that is essential for their reintegration into society. This is why we also call on supporting the fund for the victims of sexual violence of Nadia Murad and Dr. Denis Mukwege. To conclude, I want to in particular pay a special tribute to the families of victims of those who have disappeared. We all remember the weekly demonstration by the grandmothers on the May Plaza in Buenos Aires to find their children abducted by the military dictatorship. This combat continues today. These crimes are far from being in a distant past or being limited to a specific region of the world. The Syrian regime has been using these crimes systematically since 2011 to eliminate any form of opposition. The victims can be peaceful demonstrators, intellectuals, artists, and ordinary Syrians who are victims of the cruelest methods. Resolving this issue is essential in finding a political solution to this conflict, and the Security Council must ensure that they play a leading role in resolving the Syrian conflict. I want to thank France, and I now give the floor to St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President. We also wish to join other members in thanking Belgium for organizing this briefing. We also recognize and welcome the foreign ministers and deputy foreign ministers present, and thank High Commissioner Bachelet, Father Duro, and Executive Director Suka for their insightful and thoughtful briefings. St. Vincent and the Grenadines welcomes today's discussion on transitional justice, a critical component of building and sustaining peace in many settings. We wish to recall our Council's decision in November under the UK's presidency on the role of reconciliation. Transitional justice facilitates reconciliation by ensuring accountability for perpetrators and offering justice for victims. Without justice, lasting and sustainable peace would remain elusive. Without reconciliation, our Council's work to build a peaceful and prosperous world will remain futile. Mr. President, Transitional justice mechanisms should always form part of a larger political strategy that addresses the structural inequalities in conflict-affected societies to benefit all stakeholders without discrimination. This inclusive approach should consider the differentiated needs and abilities of all participants: women, youth, ethnic and religious minorities, indigenous populations, persons with disabilities, the elderly, constituents of rural communities, and civil society representatives must always be present as crafters, participants, and beneficiaries of transitional justice initiatives at all stages of the conflict cycle, before, during, and after the conflict. Indeed, building trust and ensuring justice is a never-ending process. Transitional justice mechanisms should also be complemented by sustainable development initiatives that address the root causes of insecurity and empower people to live in dignity. The Security Council should seek to engage more often the Peacebuilding Commission's strategic visionary advisory capacities, and when necessary, make use of the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund to address important governance gaps and to initiate projects and programs that stimulate socioeconomic and political participation. We emphasize, however, that there is no, as others have said, one-size-fits-all approach. These initiatives must always be designed with respect for local customs and values. To this end, we also welcome the African Union's Continental Guide for Transitional Justice, adopted 1 year ago, that takes into account the many-sided complexities of mass violence, yet privileges local traditions when delivering justice and accountability. This comprehensive roadmap is a credible source of best practices and lessons learned that all members of the international community may find useful. Mr. President, the transitional justice safeguards institutional integrity and promotes structural improvements across the peace, security, and development nexus. Well-designed transitional justice mechanisms help to restore public confidence in state institutions. They also foster normative realignments across societies as new precedents are created to provide accountability, rehabilitation, and reparations to survivors of injustices. On the issue of reparations, it must be emphasized that there should be no statutes of limitation that prevent restitution for mass atrocity crimes, especially where these historical injustices have left legacies of underdevelopment, intergenerational traumas, and social inequities in their wake. St. Vincent and the Grenadines reiterates that historical injustices of native genocide and chattel slavery, including the transatlantic slave trade, compel all former colonial powers to provide reparatory justice. Excellencies, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is a young nation that has only reclaimed its independence in a mere 40 years. Like many young societies, we understand that only by healing the collective memory enmeshed deep within our social fabric can we truly come to terms with our past indignities and embrace our future possibilities. This is the lens through which we view transitional justice, as a medium to bridge a painful past to a peaceful future by listening to those cries that too often go unheard. Thank you.
I thank the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for his statement. I now give the floor to Representative China.
Mr. President, China welcomes you presiding over this open debate. Thank Ms. Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. De Hoo, and Ms. Suka for their briefings. Some conflict-affected countries and regions are currently faced with arduous tasks of post-war reconstruction. The conflict-ridden people eagerly look forward to an early restoration of their country's rule of law and justice so that they can embark on the road of sustainable development. The UN peacebuilding architecture is committed to coordinating the international community's support for the reconstruction of post-conflict countries and has played a positive role in consolidating the fruits of peace and achieving sustainable development in the affected countries. The issue of transitional justice is one of the major areas of peacebuilding and should be taken forward within the framework of peacebuilding and sustaining peace, and its relevant discussions must be strictly limited to in-conflict and post-conflict situations. First, based on the UN Charter and universally recognized international law, it is imperative to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of a given country. There is a need to respect the countries concerned for their effort to take forward transitional justice processes step by step in a manner consistent with their own national conditions, and no models should be imposed from outside, let alone interference in their internal affairs or intervention in their internal contentions. Only by adhering to the principle of sovereignty can transitional justice efforts be justified, thereby winning the trust of the countries concerned and playing the role of promoting peace and development. Second, it is necessary to help the countries concerned enhance capacity building with a focus on the functions of their judicial systems. In the long run, no special measure, interim measure, or external measure can substitute a functioning domestic judicial system. After an extended period of turmoil and conflict, the rule of law of a given country must have been seriously affected, and it is generally faced with shortages and challenges in financial, technological, and human resources. The international community should reach out to the countries concerned and enhance their capacity building. The PBC, as a body jointly established by GA and the Council, with the advantage of straddling both political security and development areas, has an important role to play. Third, the nexus between transitional justice and political process, economic development, and social integration should be viewed through the correct lens, and integrated measures should be taken to promote the rule of law and judicial justice. Transitional justice is not just a legal issue. It should serve the interests of achieving lasting peace and stability, economic development and social progress in the country concerned, and it should serve the long-term fundamental interests of local populations. In the process of taking forward transitional justice, security sector reform and DDR should be carried out. The economic and social measures be taken, such as poverty eradication and job creation, to promote peace, achieve national reconciliation, and eliminate latent threats of conflict. Mr. President, the rule of law and justice must be highlighted not only at the national level, but also at the international level. In today's world, many ongoing conflicts have remained unresolved for decades, with ever-deepening rift between the parties. It is deplorable. These tough problems often represent the bitter consequences of breaching international consensus and disrupting the international order based on international law. The basic principles of international law, such as adhering to peaceful settlement of international disputes, prohibiting both the threat and the use of force, constitute the core of the UN Charter that underpins the contemporary international order, and as international law obligation that countries must abide by, they embody the authentic meaning of the rule of law at an international level. At the core of the international collective security architecture, the Council must shoulder the lofty responsibility of upholding international law and the basic norms governing international relations. It needs to effectively take forward political settlement, support good offices and mediation, maintain unity and cooperation, and ensure the implementation of relevant resolutions. Only in so doing can we truly prevent and resolve conflicts and avoid creating more differences and divisions. Efforts should be made to enable the people of the world to enjoy the same vision of peace and prosperity, and to facilitate the building of a community with shared future for mankind. As the late former UN Secretary General, Mr. Annan, said at the General Assembly in September 2004, those, I quote, "those who seek to bestow legitimacy must themselves embody it, and those who invoke international law must themselves submit to it. End of quote. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic. President, we welcome the Foreign Minister of Estonia, Niger, Spain, Guatemala, and yourself, Mr. President. I also wish to thank the Kingdom of Belgium for bringing this important topic to the Security Council. We are also grateful for the statements of our distinguished speakers, Ms. Bachelet, Ms. Soka, and Father Deroux, for their important words. Their first-hand experiences in applying the various mechanisms of transitional justice have been a major contribution to better understand the advantages and the challenges of transitional justice. The dramatic situation of a post-conflict population call for the urgent establishment of a state under the rule of law, a state in which human beings live in freedom, where human rights are respected, and where legislation is in accordance with international law. This return to or installation of the rule of law becomes imperative to safeguard human dignity, which is the subject of transitional justice. This is not easy to do, however. For this reason, we must continue studying and improving the various tools to improve transition mechanisms and to ensure the permanent return of peace and security for societies that have fallen victim to conflict. When a society goes through a conflict, different kinds of victims emerge. This is why we understand that we should take into account the classification and description of victims when we draw up the laws, standards, protocols, or regulations of the truth commissions, of the special courts and commissions, and the other offices created for the post-conflict transition. The aforementioned is of great importance in order to directly and specifically respond to the violations of rights in order to create more effective mechanisms for reconciliation. Mr. President, post-conflict processes must include specific mechanisms to provide families with relief and help, as well as developing programs to ensure family reunification, the search for the missing or the disappeared, the right to information on family members, and the reparation of moral harm. In addition, the Dominican Republic wishes to stress the importance of including gender analysis in the measures created to guarantee rights, justice, reparation, and non-repetition. We must take into account the realities, needs, and the changes in the roles of women who are victims surviving the conflict, above all when it comes to preventing impunity. We avail ourselves of this opportunity to congratulate the Colombian people for the efforts made to achieve a transition from the conflict to a lasting peace, to a time of reconciliation and progress for the people, victims, and for actors in the conflict. There is no doubt that transitional justice presents major challenges, such as making the most use of time, of budgets for the operation of the various mechanisms, for the participation of victims, and the development of special protocols. All these specifics will create guidelines, and we are confident that these challenges will be successfully overcome, and that the Colombian people can display its successful, more resilient, stronger, more united, and safer society. During the visit of the members of the Security Council to Colombia last year, we saw at first hand the efforts of the government and the parties, as well as the people in general, in implementing the mechanisms for a peaceful transition towards peace. We also were able to witness the important role the Security Council missions play and the major support they represent to peace and post-conflict processes. Finally, member states of the Security Council must make a greater effort to promote the culture of peace. As an international community, we are called to fight for the restoration of peace and to encourage an ideology for effective transition towards peace, democracy, justice, and guarantees of non-repetition, avoiding the political polarization of these processes at any cost. Thank you. I thank the representative of the Dominican Republic for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, ministers. I first thank Belgium's presidency for organizing this very important debate on the topic. I also thank all the briefers for their briefing and intervention. We extend our warmly welcome to ministers of Niger, Guatemala, Spain, and Vice Minister of Estonia for joining the open debate today. My delegation allies itself with a statement to be delivered by the representative of Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement. Mr. President, at the international level, justice plays an extremely important role in relation among states and has solidified its place in the international law, including the Charter of the United Nations itself. Similarly, at the national level, in conflict and post-conflict situations, transitional justice can play an impactful role in national reconciliation and development. The United Nations in general and the Security Council in particular have attached vital importance to promoting justice and the rule of law and post-conflict national reconciliation, as well as preventing a return to conflict in the future. Over the time, the Security Council has used all of its tools to address transitional justice in conflict and post-conflict contexts. And I would like to share the following points. First, justice shall be served and justice shall serve. It can be an immediate result, but it also a means to a long-term goal that is sustainable national unity and development. All efforts to promote transitional justice and post-conflict peace building need to always keep in long-term goal in consideration, including addressing the root causes of conflicts. While the path is heavy and difficult, focusing on a future that is sustainable, peaceful, and prosperous may be the way forward. We owe it our future generation to make their right choice. Second, transitional justice needs to be nationally owned and nationally led. As mentioned, justice reflects a society attempt to come to terms with the legacy of large-scale past abuses. Transitional justice needs to be a society-based and play a harmony role with other attempts to heal the society. As such, the state concerned should have the primary responsibility for its own transitional justice, reconciliation, and futures. And here I would like to pick one point in the Secretary General report, and it was stated in the briefing by Madame Bachelet that transitional justice cannot be imported or imposed from outside. Locally led and locally appropriate permutation of transitional justice has the best chances of success. In other words, national owned and nationalist is the only way, and not only a one-size-fits-all solution to all conflict. Third, international assistance is crucial and can be most effective if based on national need and particularity and capacity. The international community should focus on helping build up and strengthen national institutions and mechanisms in accordance with the national condition. Training, knowledge, and experience sharing are most useful in most situations. As it is in transition, a smooth transition should be the benchmark of international assistance, especially the UN mission. And fourth, the development and implementation of the processes and mechanism of transitional justice need to take into account the impact on an active role of women, youth, children, and other vulnerable groups in peace-building processes. And fifth, regional arrangement can play a constructive role in assisting peace and reconciliation processes in accordance with the above point and principle of international law. As a central mechanism for peace, security, and stability in Southeast Asia, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, had established the ASEAN Institutes for Peace and Reconciliation and other mechanisms for conducting activity on capacity building, experience sharing and on reconciliation, peace building, and promotion of the role of women and children. In conclusion, Mr. President, based on Vietnam's own experience, we always speak with condolence and are sympathetic with country and people who are going through difficult phases of conflict and post-conflict peace building. They can count on our continued support inside and outside the Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
I want to thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Russian Federation. Mr. Minister, Mr. President, thank you very much. Belgium has proposed to discuss a very important topic, and we're grateful to you. We also welcome the ministers here. We welcome Madame Bachelet and other keynote speakers, and we thank them for their contribution to the discussion on the role of transitional justice and peace building and sustaining efforts in conflict and post-conflict situations. Now, the approach formulated regarding the topic of our discussion is the right one, I think. It's important to determine the role and the most useful forms of transitional justice in achieving its main goal, establishing a lasting peace and preventing the resumption of conflict. Now, internal armed conflicts are the main form of the use of military force in today's world. A dangerous tendency in today's world is their proliferation against the background or as a result of the overthrow or destabilization of legitimate governments through external interference. Conflicts do not arise by themselves. Therefore, in resolving each one of them, we need to approach bearing in mind the reasons for their origin. Now, it's far from every case transitional justice is the key to establishing peace. What's important is not to get carried away by prescribing the same medication to all patients independently of the diagnosis or the symptoms of the disease. However, that does not mean that the extensive instruments of transitional justice should not be used there where they are necessary. This is a concept of a multi-dimensional phenomenon which includes not only legal but political mechanisms, national and international efforts, which are essential to establish peace in specific states. We are not convinced at the same time that the guidance note of the Secretary General of in 2010 about UN approaches to transitional justice, which was drawn up without the participation of member states, is right in all its aspects in expressing this framework. The UN has covered various phases in the use of instruments of transitional justice. In the beginning of the 90s, there were great hopes pinned to the International Tribunal on former Yugoslavia and International Tribunal for Rwanda created by the Council. However, already by the beginning of the 2000s, it became clear that this mechanism was not effective. In spite of various political statements and positions by states, the true evaluation of the work of those bodies was almost identical. The Council, first of all, agreed to their costly reform known as the completion strategy, and then it opted against replicating such mechanisms. Then the attention of the international community shifted to the International Criminal Court. This body seemed very attractive to many because unlike the tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, it was based on the principle of complementarity. So it was supposed to not replace but rather complement national justice. However, the further activity of this court showed that the idea of complementarity remained a dead letter, while the general trend towards the politicization of the work of international judicial bodies manifested itself in its ugliest forms. And to this day, the most important international achievement in combating crimes against peace and humanity is the Nuremberg Tribunal. It was created through the unity of all allies in the anti-Hitler coalition based on the principle of fair and judicial procedure. That tribunal did not need any kind of completion strategy or any kind of special and costly measures to preserve legacy. The authority of the decisions in the Nuremberg Tribunal are indisputable in spite of all the time that has elapsed. Now let's come back to today's world. By the beginning of the middle of 2000s, it became clear that the most effective forms of transitional justice are those based on a national dialogue in the country in the throes of conflict and complemented by UN efforts. Now, establishing a post-conflict reality is impossible without focusing on local traditions and specific features. Somewhere it's enough to use reconciliation. For purposes of reconciliation, you need truth and reconciliation commissions, and in other places you need traditional mechanisms such as the Gacaca trials in Rwanda. Now, since a sound national reconciliation is a determining factor for a successful resolving of a conflict and preventing their resumption, we believe that the UN must focus its efforts on providing the most appropriate forms of technical assistance to restore a national justice system that was destroyed by conflict and restoring law enforcement bodies. In this process, the UN must be an actor that provides good examples of good practices, propose solutions rather than creating problems. In this connection, it's not always acceptable to put unconditional demands by the UN, such as the unacceptability of amnesty or the primary role of the international component in mixed judiciary and investigative bodies. Now, speaking of transitional justice, it's important to openly discuss cases of its abuse. In documents that are published in the UN, it is common to write about these mechanisms only in the most superlative terms. The only criticism we hear is about the lack of political support, lack of financing, or the fact that the victims of crimes do not have an appropriately active role. However, at the same time, mechanisms of transitional justice should not be used to consolidate victory of one side over another, or to settle political accounts, or for external powers to interfere in the internal affairs of a weakened state. And transitional justice should be distinguished from direct political manipulations under the cover of the fight against impunity, which unfortunately are taking root in our organization. An unfortunate example of this is the illegitimate international investigative mechanism for Syria. A real contribution to ensuring holding accountable foreign terrorist fighters, including those active in Syria, would be to repatriate them and to prosecute them in national courts in accordance with anti-terrorist conventions and the obligation to extradite or prosecute that are enshrined in those conventions. Obviously, this should be based on the principle of the inevitability of punishment and its proportionality to the crime committed. Mr. President, we're convinced that the issues of transitional justice and the work of the Security Council do not boil down to looking for a universal formula, but rather specific work with each country's situation and on mandates of peacekeeping and political missions. The UN should not dictate, it should encourage and complement national initiatives. Thank you very much. I want to thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now want to remind speakers that you should limit your statements to a maximum of 4 minutes so that the Council can carry out its work in the best possible conditions. Those delegations with lengthy statements are kindly requested to circulate the text in writing and to deliver a condensed version when speaking in the chamber. The red light on the microphone will start blinking after 4 minutes. I wish to inform all concerned individuals that we will suspend this open debate at 1 p.m. and it will resume at 3 p.m. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Pedro Brolo, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Guatemala.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, allow me to congratulate Belgium upon assuming the presidency of the Security Council of the United Nations, and particularly yourself, Mr. Goffin. for convening us to this open debate. This reminds us that in any process of peace building, justice mechanisms are essential to attain a lasting, solid peace in order to achieve the reconciliation of peoples. Allow me to introduce myself to this council for the first time as Foreign Minister of the Republic of Guatemala. This shows that the importance that our new administration gives to the issue and the various bodies of the United Nations. I take this opportunity to represent the government of President Alejandro Giammattei Falla, who is determined to provide security and well-being to his citizens and has given priority to the dignity of human beings and the achievement of the common good through the enforcement of justice. This is one of the strategic pillars of the general policy of the government for 2020-2024. This acknowledges the vital role of multilateralism, particularly the role of the Security Council of the United Nations in maintaining international peace and security. Mr. President, our government is making efforts to achieve true national conciliation, which will make it possible to decrease the levels of polarization, build confidence, governance, and the legal certainty that makes it possible for investment to take place, as well as the comprehensive economic development of society, guaranteeing that Guatemalans will never again be pitted against each other. We also believe it is vital to look forward, to build a future, and to find space for dialogue. Negotiation and the search for common goals will benefit the entire population. As a result of the signing of the peace agreements in Guatemala in 1996, the Secretariat of Peace was created. This is a body that advises and coordinates the implementation of the peace agreements at the national level. It is a model institution, the achievements of which have been positive for peace building. Guatemala has made efforts to strengthen its justice system. Now, at the beginning of President Giammattei's mandate, we will continue giving priority to access to justice and strengthening the institutions responsible for administering justice in an effective, responsible manner. When it comes to our international role and commitment to peace, the state of Guatemala has historically contributed with military personnel deployed in peacekeeping operations. We consider these as a special part of our foreign policy. There are currently blue helmets deployed in 7 peace operations. Mr. President, Guatemala reiterates its commitment to the Security Council to continue sending troops, since this is a noble task of the United Nations, performed under singularly difficult circumstances. Global challenges such as peacekeeping and security, as well as respect for human rights, must be dealt with in this forum. And this calls for a unified political will of the international community. 75 years after the creation of this organization, we believe in the relevance of the role of the United Nations in resolving conflicts and in promoting the rule of law. Thank you very much. I thank His Excellency, Mr. Brolo, for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Arantxa González Laya, Minister for Foreign Affairs of European Union and Cooperation of Spain.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is the first time I'm speaking to this council as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the European Union and Cooperation of Spain. Now, I'm from a country that is a strong democracy today. We're a state that scrupulously respects human rights and the rule of law. However, Spain is a country that is aware that not that long ago, just one generation ago, the generation of my parents, suffered a cruel civil war that led to a long dictatorship. And also, we have suffered terrorism more recently. Now, we believe that we strongly believe in our model, and the transition towards democracy took the form of the 1978 Constitution. And in fact, this was an example of a transitional justice put into practice. However, we believe that we need to continue to respond to the demands of our citizens and civil society. Our experience has shown us that no country is immune to the huge risks of hate speech and fear-mongering. They can easily degenerate into violations of human rights and the denial of the principles and values of democracy, and ultimately they can lead to conflict. This is why Spain has constantly worked in the area of transitional justice along two tracks, the domestic and international. Now, as far as the domestic track, a law of historical memory was adopted in 2007. The goal is not to leave no one behind, listening to the testimonies of the victims and preserving their memory, with the goal of making sure that they're not forgotten. Now, at the international level, my country is strongly committed to transitional justice processes around the world. In the 1980s, we supported the efforts of the Contadora Group, which led to the Central American Peace Accords 1 and 2. And today, Spain is working with the United Nations in the transitional justice process in Colombia. It's essential over and over again to state that peace and justice are not contradictory realities. No lasting peace is possible without justice, and no justice is possible unless there's truth, accountability, and recognition of the dignity of victims and reparations for them. There are three elements I'd like to highlight. First of all, combat against impunity. We have developed a very valuable instrument to achieve this goal, the Rome Statute. This is why we believe that the members of the Security Council must cooperate with the International Criminal Court. It's essential to strengthen the court, to renew the court for it to be more effective and expand its base. The number of states parties should be increased, and there should be an ambition to achieve the universality of justice. The process that is beginning this year to elect a new prosecutor and 6 justices is an excellent opportunity to achieve that universality. Second, dignity of victims. Care for the victims of terrorism and the repression against defenders of democracy is a priority for my government. We're not talking about only recognition and reparations. It's essential that their testimony is preserved as a preventive instrument that is very effective. This is why the Security Council must bear in mind synergies that exist between different agendas, the agenda of protection of civilians, children in armed conflict, and women, peace, and security. Now, the role of women is essential in any process of transition. Their inclusion should be across the board, including in the decision-making process. To make this possible, Spain, together with Finland, has committed itself to the 2025 commitment aimed at achieving that goal by 2025. Third, and lastly, it's essential to achieve truth and guarantees of non-repetition. And members of the Security Council must bear this in mind when they design mandates for peacekeeping missions or appoint special representatives for the Security Council. This year, we are marking the 75th anniversary of this organization, which is fighting for universal peace and which Spain wholeheartedly supports. A lot remains to be done, but we know the road that we need to take. We need to continue believing in multilateralism, because only multilateralism can strengthen peace in countries that have not yet achieved it. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to thank Her Excellency Mrs. González-Laya for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Mr. President, facing the past and seeking a better future, this spirit is at the center of international transitional justice. Successful transitional justice initiatives contribute to peace building and sustaining peace, and in the long term, to achieving SDG 16 by strengthening institutions and establishing the rule of law, which are crucial in making lasting peace possible. It is an important point to make sure that transitional justice initiatives do not harm peace, but rather help to sustain it. Mr. President, I believe that trust is what makes a peaceful society. Trust between people and trust by the people in their government. A society that has endured conflict often lacks the foundation for trust, or has seen that foundation destroyed during the course of conflict. In these moments, people are full of fear, uncertainty, and grievance, and deprived of access to justice. This is exactly why the human security approach is so important in the implementation of transitional justice initiatives. What we should aim for is not to solely punish perpetrators through a top-down approach, but to support the transformation of a society to a state where people can live an empowered life free from fear. The building of strong, effective, and trustworthy institutions is an integral part of a peace building and sustaining peace, and should remain a crucial part of transitional justice as well. Here, I would like to emphasize that legitimacy, inclusivity, and local ownership are key to the successful implementation of transitional justice, particularly with regard to institutional reforms. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. Rather, local context, history, and culture in each case need to be taken into account. Transitional justice processes and mechanisms must be considered legitimate and inclusive and based on local ownership if they are to gain the trust of the population. International support must aim at helping those countries in the process of transitional justice in their endeavoring to stand on their own feet. Japan is committed to supporting the development and improvement of judicial and security systems and institutions. We've been continuously supporting conflict-affected countries such as Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mali, Afghanistan, and Iraq by providing capacity building and supporting judicial and security sector reform. Japan is also actively involved in the United Nations efforts for peace building and sustaining peace, and is a proud advocate of the importance of institution building, including the context of transitional justice. Last month, Japan was appointed as one of 2 vice chairs at the Peacebuilding Commission for 2020. Japan looks forward to working closely with Canada as chair and Colombia as co-vice chair. Taking this opportunity, we would like to further strengthen cooperation between the PBC and the Security Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
President, thank you for convening this important meeting. We welcome the crucial input from the briefers, including the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, and my own country, Norway. Transitional justice exposes the human dimension of a conflict by putting the rights of victims first. In society emerging from conflict, inclusive and effective responses are an investment in peace, stability, justice, and democracy. Transitional justice consists of a broad set of measures, from ensuring accountability for international crimes, honoring the victim's right to truth, acknowledging their suffering, to providing reparation for damage done. Effective and inclusive institutions on all levels have a vital role. The whole of society must come to terms with the past and work towards reconciliation. Yet, this is not easy. Transitional justice measures are set up in complex and sensitive political circumstances. We have experienced in peace negotiations that one of the most difficult questions is impunity. Those with the most power to end conflicts are often the least likely to submit to justice for their crimes. President, as we have heard this morning, the Colombian peace agreement showed that the goals of peace and justice for victims could be mutually reinforcing. Today, 3 years into the implementation, the Truth Commission, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and the Commission for Missing Persons are fully operational. Support from the Security Council played a crucial role. While not without challenges and controversies, Colombia's experience with transitional justice, while crucial in its own regard, also provides us with important lessons for other peace processes. President, civil society, in particular women, should be including rights from designing through implementation of transitional justice mechanisms. Women must be seen as peace builders rather than victims. By integrating a gender equality perspective, conditions are improved for inclusive and democratic societies where human rights are respected. One Nordic example is the specialized police teams to the UN mission in South Sudan. They support the national police to prevent, investigate, and prosecute sexual and gender-based violence. Let me mention 4 measures that the UN can take to strengthen our work. Firstly, the mandate of UN peace operations should include support to nationally owned transitional justice initiatives. Here we can draw lessons from MINUSMA and MONUSCO. Secondly, United Nations envoys and special representatives should be encouraged to promote transitional justice initiatives and inclusion in all levels of a peace process. Thirdly, this Council must strengthen its partnership with regional organizations, including the African Union, which last year adopted a transitional justice policy for supporting reconciliation. Finally, the advisory role of the Council of the Peacebuilding Commission could be better utilized. There are valuable lessons learned from countries that have gone through transitional justice processes. President, when done right, transitional justice is transformative, providing local institutions with legitimacy for the challenging path towards lasting peace. When war-torn society takes decisive steps towards peace, we, the international community, should support these efforts in every possible way. The victims of conflicts deserve nothing less. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Liechtenstein.
President, at the heart of our discussion today is the question of how peace and justice correlate to each other. The Council itself has answered this question by stating that a comprehensive approach to transitional justice, including promotion of healing and reconciliation, is critical to consolidation of peace and stability. A clear and strong statement, and we fully agree with it. Such a comprehensive approach encompasses the dimensions of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantee of non-reoccurrence. That is prevention. The overall purpose of transitional justice is indeed to help societies overcome a difficult, often painful past, promote reconciliation, and support a common way forward towards a sustainable peace. Transitional justice is thus also a key component to conflict prevention and the implementation of Sustainable Goal 16. National ownership of such processes is essential. But in many cases, in particular, where atrocity crimes were committed at a large scale, international or regional assistance may not only be helpful, but indeed necessary. There are various examples where truth and reconciliation commissions have played a supportive role in post-conflict situations. A commitment to the right to truth is indispensable. Any person who has suffered atrocities has the right to know who is responsible. Any person whose family members have disappeared has the right to discover their fate and whereabouts. Every society where these crimes have taken place has the right to learn their history without lies or denial. These are inevitably painful processes, but they form the basis for moving forward together and to take the measures necessary to ensure that the same will not happen again. These processes also give victims their rightful place in the discussion, a place that they are too often denied. We have heard in yesterday's discussions how often children's grievances and calls for justice are neglected in peace processes, and with what devastating results for sustainable peace. Similar things can be said with respect to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. In addition to securing justice for individual violations, transitional justice has to address in particular the context of gender inequality and injustice that gives rise to conflict. Mr. President, if the Council has a strong conceptual basis to work from, its practical record is a different story. To begin with, there is no collective political will in this Council's membership to translate the thematic agreements on justice into practice. In the case of Myanmar, it has not even seriously considered, let alone acknowledged, the unanimous decision of the International Court of Justice, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, on provisional measures to be taken by the authorities of Myanmar on the basis of the Genocide Convention. In so doing, the Council is missing a unique opportunity to help guarantee non-reoccurrence. In the ongoing conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic, it has ignored the accountability and justice dimension pretty much altogether and passed the ball to the General Assembly, which has established the IIIM as a result. But in fairness, there is also a conceptual difficulty with giving transitional justice tasks to this Council. Of course, there are peacekeeping operations, and your very useful concept note has listed those operations where the Council has included the relevant elements in their respective mandates. But for the most part, the Council will not stay engaged for the long years that are often required to provide transitional justice. The UN body most underutilized in this respect seems to be the Peacebuilding Commission, which has the mandate, I quote, to support the development of integrated strategies in order to lay the foundation for sustainable development, end of quote, of which transitional justice is a key ingredient. Ongoing discussions on the PBC should therefore place strong emphasis on this dimension, and the UN system should be equipped to assist all states who do not have a PBC configuration but are still facing transitional justice challenges. Mr. President, it is a convenient talking point to say that there can be no peace without justice, while one that is less en vogue today than it was a few years ago. In practice, however, we often prioritize peace over justice, and certainly this Council does. How often have we heard in this room that the involvement of the ICC in Darfur, ironically mandated by this very Council, was not only unwarranted, but in fact harmful for peace and stability in Sudan? As it turns out, the authorities in Sudan seem to have come to a different conclusion. We are following very closely the reports concerning a possible transfer of those indicted by the ICC in connection with the crimes committed in Darfur. The mere fact that these discussions are taking place is the strongest possible statement in support of the relevance of justice for sustainable peace. We hope, of course, that we will witness these transfers. Trials in The Hague would be a late and partial relief for the suffering of the victims of the genocide in Darfur, and they would illustrate how short-sighted, 75 years after its creation, the Council's approach to the challenge of peace and justice still is. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Liechtenstein for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement. At the outset, we would like to congratulate Belgium with the assumption of the presidency in the Security Council and pay our respect to His Excellency Mr. Philippe Goffin, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense of Belgium. We should also like to welcome Her Excellency Ms. Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and other distinguished panelists at today's open debate. Mr. President, promoting and sustaining international peace is a key issue to the non-aligned movement. The movement and its member states have historically opposed war and supported peace, fought against colonialism and neocolonialism, rejected all forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and struggled to suppress slavery and slave trade. The movement reaffirms and underscores its principled position and commitment with regard to the promotion of the pacific settlement of disputes in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, international law, and the relevant United Nations resolutions, including those adopted by the Security Council. The strengthening of the role of the United Nations in the peaceful settlement of disputes, conflict prevention and resolution, confidence building, national reconciliation, and post-conflict peace building, rehabilitation, reconstructions, and development contributes to strengthening of international peace and security, and to saving future generations from the scourge of war and armed conflict. The member state of the movement stands ready to take effective measures for the suppression of the acts of aggression or other breaches of peace to defend, promote, and encourage the settlement of international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace, security, and justice are not endangered. The movement also stresses that the root causes of conflicts should be addressed in a coherent, well-planned, coordinated, and comprehensive manner with other political, social, and economic and developmental instruments. During the 18th summit held in Baku, the Republic of Azerbaijan, in October last year, the head of state and government of the non-aligned movement took note of the importance and merit of the concept of sustaining peace as understood in the resolutions adopted by the General Assembly 70/262 and the Security Council 2282, and reaffirmed the primary responsibility of national governments, their leadership, and ownership in identifying, driving, and directing priorities, strategies, and activities. The non-aligned movement also emphasized the need for the involvement of all segments of society in peace processes, including women and youth, who can play an important role in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, as well as in peacekeeping and peacebuilding efforts, and in building peaceful and resilient societies. Inclusivity is key to advancing national peacebuilding processes and objectives in order to ensure that the needs of all segments of society are taken into account. Mr. President, the non-aligned movement proceeds from the strict belief that the observance of the principles of international law and the fulfillment in good faith of the obligations assumed by states in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations are of the greatest importance for the maintenance of international peace and security. Stemming from that, in cases where violations of international law take place, those responsible must be held accountable in order to international law take place, to prevent their recurrence and seek sustainable peace, justice, truth, and reconciliations. Otherwise, impunity will go rampant and perpetrators would be de facto encouraged to continue pursuing their crimes. Mr. President, in conclusion, the non-aligned movement underscores that there cannot be development without peace and no peace without development. Therefore, we should redouble our collective efforts to improve synergies between the activities of peacekeeping and peacebuilding as appropriate, and to attain the overall objective of sustaining peace, thus fulfilling the commitments made when our heads of state and government adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Azerbaijan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Mr. President, let me first commend Belgium for organizing this open debate and the briefers for their insightful presentations. Coming to terms with the past to work towards a just and peaceful future is at the core of transitional justice strategies and should inform the Council's discussions on post-conflict strategies. Brazil would like to highlight 4 main points in today's debate. First, there are no universal recipes for transitional justice processes. To be effective, transitional justice strategies should not only take into account the local context, but also be based on widespread consultation among different sectors of societies emerging from armed conflict. Moreover, national and local actors, especially women and youth, should be directly involved in the implementation of transitional justice programs in order to ensure their sustainability. Developing an approach that is sensitive to the situation of the most vulnerable groups in post-conflict settings is crucial to guaranteeing an inclusive, locally owned transitional process while avoiding stigmatization. In this regard, international efforts should aim at assisting countries to develop the necessary national capacity to spearhead the process. Second, despite the uniqueness of each process, they all share basic values. Aspirational goals from early experiences gradually moved into binding legal rules, consolidating the parameters for current and future exercises. As the Secretary General's guidance note points out, international legal obligations frame transitional justice measures. International law envisages guarantees of non-repetition of violations and sets the basis to fight impunity for international crimes, even in times of political transition. Most importantly, the axiological foundations and legal grounds of transitional justice make it not a matter of whether, but how and when to implement it, which leads to our third point. Mr. President, transitional justice is a constant balancing exercise. Imperatives of peace and justice, of law and politics, may be hard to reconcile in practice. The common answer, that they are complementary to each other, is a useful guideline, although not a concrete or detailed one. Transitional justice strategies should encompass potential tensions between peace and justice and find ways to overcome them. Criminal prosecution for the most serious crimes can be combined with acts of reconciliation by perpetrators of minor offenses and a fair program of reparations to the victims. Calibrating the variety of transitional justice mechanisms is key to achieving balance between seemingly contradictory goals. Fourth, the combination of different mechanisms only partially addresses the challenges of building peace. Transitional justice should be integrated into broader peace-building efforts. Both security sector reform and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs may benefit from well-planned transitional justice strategies. Vetting programs may gather information and at the same time contribute to non-recurrence. However, if poorly designed, these tools may undermine each other. The prospect of criminal prosecution might negatively impact DDR, whereas reintegration might generate resentment if not accompanied by reparation to victims. All these initiatives must be mutually supportive in order to build resilient, peaceful, and just societies. Mr. President, transitional justice is a multidimensional endeavor. Significant aspects of the matter fall outside the mandate of the Security Council, particularly in situations that do not amount to armed conflict. While recognizing the limitations of the Council in this particular issue, we consider that it can make an important contribution to transitional justice processes in post-conflict societies, including by encouraging the incorporation of transitional justice mechanisms into peace agreements and designing the mandate of UN missions in support of the implementation of transitional justice processes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Robert Mardini, Permanent Observer of the International Committee of the Red Cross to the United Nations.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President.
After the guns go silent, transitional justice creates a space for truth, accountability, and reconciliation. It helps break the cycles of violence and atrocities. Equally important, it plays a humanitarian role. It recognizes wounds and addresses the suffering of individuals, families, and communities whose lives were fundamentally changed by the conflict. One humanitarian issue that intersects with transitional justice is the situation of missing persons and their families. If you speak to families, you hear that their suffering is both acute and haunting. It is the last open wound. As this Council meets to discuss how to improve transitional justice mechanisms, the ICRC has the following 3 recommendations. First, include a stated objective on the clarification of the fate of missing persons and the support to families for all cases of missing persons without discrimination. Such mechanisms must involve the families and have due regard for their emotional well-being and security. We encourage the Security Council, UN member states, and UN missions to see transitional justice processes as an important avenue to implement Security Council Resolution 2474 on missing persons in armed conflict adopted last year. Second, provide all families looking for a missing relative an individualized answer and support. This holds even if the case is not part of a judicial investigation under transitional justice mechanism. People can also go missing in circumstances that may fall outside the scope of the judicial pillar or a transitional justice mechanism. For instance, combatants can go missing in action, or civilians can go missing during displacement or during intercommunal violence. Even these families have a right to know the fate and whereabouts of their missing relatives. Third, there must be no impunity for war crimes. In all types of armed conflict, states have the obligation under international humanitarian law to investigate and prosecute suspects of alleged war crimes, some of which may include violations that have led to people going missing, including cases of enforced disappearances. The ICRC stands ready to provide expert advice and support states, UN missions, and transitional justice mechanisms on ways to first include the issue of missing persons and their families in transitional justice processes, whether in truth-seeking, reparations, or judicial pillars. Second, guarantee complementarity between transitional justice processes and any other mechanism set up to clarify the fate and whereabouts of missing persons. And third, ensure consistency between transitional justice processes and states' obligation under international humanitarian law. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie.
I thank Mr. Robert Martini for his statement. There are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of the members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m. The meeting is suspended.